Over the last few years, European citizens have begun to get more and more restless, as we've been reporting on this show, with neoliberal economic policies, with the stranglehold of the Troika, with the austerity policies being imposed by the German banks and backed by the European elites. And the result of this, at last, has been the birth of new movements. These movements are small in many parts of Europe, but in two Mediterranean countries, Greece and Spain, they've become huge. And an old word has acquired a sinister new meaning: populism. All that populism means in the jargon of neoliberal politicians and newspapers and journalists is the other, is something that is not the extreme center that rules these countries and has been ruling them under neoliberalism now for many decades. The center-left, the center-right, the center constitute something very concrete. They can change governments, but the politics and the policies don't change. And anything that challenges this is called populism. Now, the rise of Podemos again has been analyzed, stupidly in my opinion, as a rise of populism, when all it is large numbers of citizens, young and old in the case of Spain, fighting for a different way of life and fighting for different policies. With me to discuss this is Luke Stobart from the University of Hertfordshire. Expert on Spain, has written some very fine essays and is a member of Podemos, has spent a lot of time in Spain and travels to and fro that country. Luke, welcome.
Hi.
Tell me first, what is Podemos? I mean, the name in itself sometimes attracts a bit of suspicion, because is this name Podemos taken from Obama's vapid slogan, "Yes, we can"? Which meant nothing, or does it refer to something else?
The name comes from the expression "si se puede," which is also can be translated as "yes, we can," which was used by the anti-eviction movement in Spain. This was one of the new social movements that emerged during the period of the crisis. A very massive movement, had a real impact on the public debate, but most importantly, actually showed that changes could be won through protest action, through disobedience, but working in a very non-sectarian way. They managed to stop at least 1,000 families from being evicted, and they've managed to bring in reforms and win court cases, which effectively mean it's becoming harder to evict people from their homes. There are a lot of evictions still continuing, but Podemos, I think, really captures that spirit. I mean, the Obama saying actually came from movements in America by Latin American cleaners, and then it was translated into English. So there's a nice circle here.
Yes, and so much for the name. Let's now go back to the origins of the movement. I remember in the days before the Indignados took over the squares, there was a huge debate within this milieu about whether to go for politics or not, or simply to be, spontaneous activists, fight for the right of immigrants, fight against evictions, and all the wonderful things that they did. So when did the debate begin as to challenge the power of the extreme center in Spain, and how did it evolve?
I think the Indignados movement, or the 15th of May movement, as people call it in the Spanish state, I think was very much a reaction to the hollowing out of official politics. It was also a response to the massive social crisis that was developing in Spain after 2008. But clearly there was an important critique of official politics, and the square occupations were organised in a way almost as an antithesis of what people understood of politics to be. So it was participatory, it was radical, it was willing to break the law. It also denounced the whole of the political establishment, and not just the right wing of the political establishment. And the famous slogan of the movement was, "They don't represent us, no nos representan." And I think, you know, that what Podemos has done is it's taken that same spirit, that same reaction to the failure of politics, but put it into an electoral form, but taking a lot of the characteristics of the 15th of May movement, for example, the mass participation in the local groups of Podemos, which are called circles, and the elaboration of policy through discussion on a mass level using the new media, and also trying to do politics differently. So we talk about, you know, ways of actually controlling our representatives. We pay them much less than most parties would pay. We put our accounts transparently out on the internet. We try and avoid kind of people staying in elected posts permanently and have constant kind of renovation. And so I think Podemos has decided to do electoral politics, but in a way which is almost the opposite of the electoral politics that we've known. But I think there was clearly a shift about a year and a half ago, when after several years of some of the most impressive social movements, such as the anti-eviction movement, but also the coloured tides, which were wearing different coloured t-shirts and demonstrating and occupying against the cuts in the public sector, and grassroots workers' initiatives like the March for Dignity. These movements were really on a mass scale. You're talking about sometimes demonstrations of 1 million plus people. The Indignados movement itself, according to some surveys, 1 in 4 people actually went down to one of those square occupations. And I think after seeing such historically large social movements hitting a wall, which was that the political establishment that could bring about the change was actually increasingly less likely to allow any kind of reforms. I think a lot of people came to the conclusion that we had to actually stand and push them out of the way as well, or at least we had to stop them from disorganizing our movement.
And here, of course, the influence from South America was also important.
Of course.
The Spanish Podemos leaders, many of them worked in South America. Mm-hmm. Some worked in Ecuador, some worked in Venezuela, so there was some idea of what was going on there. But of course, they developed their own line and their own tactics. How did the left establishment in Spain receive this? Well, when I say left, I mean obviously in a broad sense. The center-left, PSOE, but to the left of that center-left, there was another group which united other leftists called Izquierda Unida. How did they initially react to the birth of Podemos?
I think both of the two organisations that you've mentioned have reacted very badly in different ways. I mean, the leader of the Socialists at present, who's supposed to be the kind of renovation figure, one of Podemos's victories so far has to actually achieve the resignation of the previous Socialist leader, because obviously the Socialists are feeling very defensive, their vote is plummeting. But the current leader has said that his tactic is to try and make Spaniards understand that Podemos is an extreme left organisation. And clearly, you know, the leadership of Podemos do come from very radical social movement kind of backgrounds and have links with radical left internationally. But this has not worked at all. In fact, last week, El País published a survey which found that most Spaniards situated Podemos on or near to the extreme left on the scale, but yet its support has actually grown to 28% of the population now. So that tactic is clearly not going to work. There is a shift left in Spanish society, and Podemos is connecting with that. It doesn't actually use the term that we are a left-wing organisation. It tends to say that we're neither left nor right. Now, sometimes that creates a bit of confusion about our actual strategy, but I think part of that is trying to break with the kind of traditional politics where there's a kind of false left and perhaps a less false right, but very little difference between the two. It was a difference between Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola, and organisations like Izquierda Unida tended to have a strategy which was based on reaching alliances to govern locally or govern regionally with the very neoliberal Socialist Party, and which often meant that they just got absorbed into a kind of neoliberal management of society. Izquierda Unida, I think, also reacting extremely defensively to the growth of Podemos. They were growing massive, well, not massive, they were growing significantly in the polls, and that's fallen. And they're currently pulling themselves apart. Some of their younger leaders, often people that have been involved in the Indignados movement themselves, are now leaving the organisation and working with Podemos in joint municipal projects. And the leadership of Izquierda Unida clearly do not want to break from this strategy of allying with social liberal parties in order to gain institutional power, even though you have a chance of an incredibly strong alternative in the form of Podemos with a different kind of strategy.
Luke, describe how it came about that the Spanish economy and the Spanish social structure almost went into a period of disintegration. This was obviously the Wall Street crash of 2008 played a huge part. But even prior to that, it was a very dodgy structure, over-dependent on building, over-dependent on that particular industry, which different parties tried to link up with, which led to a great deal of corruption within the PSOE ranks and other ranks. And the feeling one gets is that that particular structure, very fragile in many ways. The minute you had the first crisis, it fell. But was there more to it than that, or was the core of the Spanish economy the building industry?
The building industry was so important in Spain that in 2006, 15% of GDP was related to either building or real estate. And roughly 1 in 5 workers would have been working in that sector as well. This is something that's related to the way that the Spanish democracy, after 40 years of fascist dictatorship, was born in a period in which internationally there was a shift away from public-funded industry and productive development in Europe and towards a more financially based economy. There was all sorts of attempts at trying to make the Spanish economy more competitive. For example, a series of labour reforms were introduced which put most young people on precarious temporary contracts. There was mass privatisations actually under a social democratic government of Felipe González. And this was an attempt to kind of compensate for underlying problems in the Spanish economy. There was clearly a fall in the profit rates back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But what it did was, by specialising in housing, they created a bubble, which was actually going to add new kind of forms of instability to the Spanish economy. And when it exploded, what had previously been a motor driving the whole economy forward became a motor driving the whole economy back. And there was, massive growth in unemployment. We now have over 50% unemployment among young people, over 26% unemployment for the majority of the Spanish society. So it was always an extremely fragile model.
So conditions with this large-scale unemployment for young people and older people are dire in Spain today. I mean, one reads reports, rarely covered in the mainstream press, of how people are managing in small towns, in villages, even in the big cities. I'm saying all this because the problems that would confront a radical government, if it were elected to power, are huge.
Sure.
So let us suppose in 2 years, whenever, there's a Podemos government, like Syriza in Greece today, but in very different circumstances. Has Podemos a program? Has Podemos the ability to be able to deal with this? I'm not saying in an ultimatist way, but just to make a start, begin the transition.
I'm sure Podemos has the strategy to make a start. Recently, a report was commissioned from some quite popular left-wing economists in Spain to put forward a very concise economic strategy for Podemos. And this includes a series of measures which, of course, most political parties would never consider, but actually for most people are common sense measures which would make an immediate difference to the economy. For example, chasing the enormous amount of tax fraud that takes place in Spain, mainly by the most richest of society. This would bring in massive amounts of revenues to the state. Also, the debt at the moment in Spain is 100% of GDP. And so, I mean, it's not quite as high as in Greece, but it's not far
still,
off.
it's, yeah.
And the Spanish economy is, of course, 4 times bigger than the Greek economy. So we're talking about a huge amount of debt, which is acting as a completely suffocating weight over the Spanish economy. My personal feeling is that we'll have to be incredibly audacious in order to turn this around. I think that a massive increase in public spending, as the Podemos economists are advocating, would be a step forward. However, I also think that there's a danger in assuming that we can just go back to the kind of policies that were very fashionable before the 1970s in Europe of
Keynesianism.
Keynesianism, exactly, which is the model explicitly defended by Pablo Iglesias and his economists. I think we have to go beyond that. I think the crisis is far more structural, far more systemic. There's reluctance to invest by the financial institutions in Spain, quite simply because the profit rates are too low. I don't think just increasing state spending will necessarily have a knock-on effect on that kind of activity. I think a massive non-payment of the debt will be absolutely essential in order to start turning things around. And there's a debate in Podemos about whether we should renegotiate the debt, restructure it, or whether we should do an audit and then identify which of the debt is illegitimate, which of the debt was just money that was handed massively to the banks and squandered.
Like in Greece.
Such as in Greece. I mean, we're talking about an international phenomenon. In the case of the money that went to the Spanish banks, it was lent at 0% interest rate, but then they lent it back to the Spanish government at 4% interest rate. So they made massive amounts of money. And there's all sorts of arguments as to why ordinary people should not pay for that debt, which has come onto their shoulders because of the risky and dangerous decisions by Spanish bankers.
Now, the whole compact which was agreed between effectively PSOE and the old establishment was that instead of a decaying fascist dictator, they would have the Bourbons back in power as a royal family, and to their shame, they accepted it. They accepted NATO. They accepted all the things they had initially been opposed to. After all, the old Socialist Party had fought for a republic. This is a very old democratic demand in Spain, a demand for the Spanish Republic, and they caved in on that. On these political questions, is there any shift now? I mean, for instance, I heard Iglesias saying that about the monarchy, he says, well, they can go and earn their living just like everyone else. But is there, how are they going to deal with it? A referendum?
I think everyone who is supporting Podemos would want
a referendum on the monarchy.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And there were big protests when Juan Carlos resigned as king, calling for a referendum, which Podemos was supporting. I think, however, it's important to point out that Podemos has tended to focus on social issues rather than, let's say, formal kind of symbolic issues of political institutionalism, let's say. In a way that makes it a bit different from the communist left, which also was very much part of accepting the monarchy in the 70s and reaching a whole series of compromises with the Franco elites. I think the Communist Party would tend to insist that having a kind of Republican model is their kind of objective, whereas I think Podemos is much more practical in terms of talking about the issues that people are really suffering from. And part of that is because they want to appeal to all sorts of working class people who may not even identify themselves particularly as left-wing,
exactly.
may not identify with the Republic even.
Yeah.
And I think this is something which has a positive side, which is that it's about channeling the kind of interests of the popular classes into a genuine political project based on genuine change, rather than being too distracted by symbols, even though, of course, everyone in Podemos, I think, was really happy.
But you see, the thing is that the interesting thing is that what the South Americans did when they transferred from being social movements into political parties or political movements is that they, in 3 cases, they went for new constitutions. And the Venezuelan constitution, for the first time, gave people the right to recall a president. Right. So they ultra-democratized their countries, which is why it was grotesque, the West calling them dictatorships. And I would have thought that one of the things Podemos will have to consider is a convention or a constituent assembly or something to create a new constitution. I mean, a referendum is one possibility, but the constitution, I think, is necessary, a new constitution, also to begin to deal with questions which the Francoists repressed very brutally, the national questions. I mean, under Felipe's government, the PSOE government in Spain, the tortures of the Basques, the disappearances of Basque militants. I mean, I was in Spain a few years ago, and I was told by many Basque militants who are no longer militant that because they once were members of ETA or sympathetic to it, they still have to go and register every single week with the police. So they were kept under permanent surveillance. And the way Franco and that regime treated the nationalities is, you know, now that we have all the facts, we knew it even then, and not just the Basques, but the Catalans. It's quite atrocious, the crushing of language, the attempt to destroy people's identity, etc., etc. So a constitution, I would have thought, is vital in order to establish, at least on paper, a properly federal Spain. But then you have the added question now of Catalan independence. Will they go for it? Won't they go for it? Podemos, I think, I mean, they don't have a fixed position on this, and I think their leaders are hoping that if Podemos were to win, it would be such a tremendous relief for the whole Spanish state that the Catalans might forget about independence. Well, they might, but they might not. A lot depends on how it's dealt with, and a lot depends on whether or not there is a new constitution in which all the nationalities participate to see if they can live together in a common state.
Having a constituent process, perhaps similar to some of the constituent processes that you've had in Latin America, is very much a key strategy for Podemos, and is something that's supported by, I think, everyone involved. It's interesting that in terms of the Catalan question, that's sometimes held up, I think mistakenly, as an alternative to the current movement that's taking place in Catalonia. The current movement in Catalonia is mainly a left-wing movement. It's a movement which actually, if you like, goes back to the struggles against a complete Spanish nationalist model of the Francoist dictatorship, where you couldn't speak Catalan in public places, where Catalan and Basque publications were banned. And it's a movement that comes out of that experience and has had to fight in order to try and normalize its language and its culture. And even today, there are still some places, whether it's you want to see a film or you go to a court or you talk to a policeman, where Spanish is the language used, and there's a level of imposition. So it's a movement that comes out from a genuine discrimination, and it's also a movement based on mass participation. We've had millions of people demonstrating, including at one point they formed a human chain across the whole of the Catalan territory. And it seems to me that it's very clear that you, one, need to defend that kind of movement because ultimately it's calling for democracy. You can not support independence, but you can support the people's right to choose whether they belong to one state or another.
Yes.
The right, I mean, just as we'd support the right to divorce between a couple, based, you know, that the one person can decide whether they want to continue in that relationship or not. I think we can apply that to the relationship between territories. The other thing is that there's a lot of repression by the Spanish state of that process. So the attempt to hold an official referendum was prevented by the Spanish courts. A symbolic referendum was held on the 9th of November, in which 2.3 million Catalans participated. And the police were informing local schools that they couldn't hold this symbolic referendum there, and even threatening people with arrest, but people still went on the streets. I think Podemos needs to support that and denounce the repression. It hasn't done enough of that. And what it's tended to do is hold up the you know, future constitutional process, which of course is contingent on Podemos winning nationally, as the way to achieve a new deal for Catalonia. And it may be the case that actually the leadership of Podemos is very sincere about that desire. I mean, Pablo Iglesias and his team, who've been making TV programs for many years, have always, I think, stood out for having quite a sensitive approach towards the different national identities that exist in Spain. And Podemos, unlike the traditional parties, does understand that Spain is a kind of multinational state, and that the different national identities should actually be properly recognised and properly organised politically. Having said that, it's really important, I think, if we're going to bring in any kind of social change, it's going to come through people protesting from below, whether it's about not paying the debt, whether it's about winning the right to self-determination. And it's really important, I think, to support the movements that are on the streets. Yeah? If they get beaten, that will weaken the chance of other protests over other issues. I think the national struggle is very linked to the struggle for better social conditions in Catalonia, and I think Podemos needs to take a far more clearer support for that movement than it currently is.
Luke, to conclude, how do you think Podemos is going to do in the regional elections that lie ahead? The PSOE has forwarded the one in Andalusia. The others will take place in May. What are the polls saying, and what is the mood?
There are regional elections at different times in different places. The Catalan one is in September. I mean, I think generally across the whole of Spain, we're seeing Podemos emerging as the opposition to the right. Andalusia is one of the places where the PSOE have held up, and clearly Susana González, who's the president at the moment, is hoping to, I think, mount a challenge for the leadership of the national PSOE if she gets a good result in Andalusia. Having said that, Podemos is stronger in terms of participation in the local circles in Andalusia than any other territory. And it's got some very strong local you know, leaders, which I think are going to, you know, compete with González very strongly. And also there's a very inspiring trade union in Andalusia called the SAT,
yes,
which has been occupying supermarkets, taking the food and giving them to the poor, and they're massively popular for doing that. They're now coming over and working with Podemos. They've broken from Izquierda Unida. And so I think things are moving in Podemos' direction. I wouldn't like to say I can definitely predict the result of the Andalusian elections, but certainly things are moving in Podemos' direction.
Thank you, Luke. Well, a new beginning, we hope, in Spain as well, and we will be returning to discuss the situation in Spain as it evolves over the year. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.